Good evening. My name is Gordela Weiss-Sussex and I'm the convener of German Studies at the Institute of Modern Languages Research. And I would very much like to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. It is the 6th Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert-Miller Memorial Lecture, and it's organized by the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies at the IMLR. Now, you probably are all very familiar with the work of the Research Centre, but I just wanted to say again, it is a centre that focuses on German-speaking immigrants in this country, and it provides a record of the wealth of contributions they made to the UK in all sorts of spheres. If you think about their impact alone in the areas of the arts, I mean, that alone is immeasurably rich. Think of literature, music, visual arts, journalism, and of course, theatre. And it is to two of these émigrés that this lecture, and in fact the whole lecture series, is dedicated. Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert-Miller were Austrian actors who fled their home country and came to London in 1939. And they got together with a number of people of similar backgrounds, and they founded the Laterne, an exile theatre here in London. And they worked for this with all their energies. They wrote scripts, they directed, they compared, they acted. And we know this because some 10 years ago, Daniel Miller, their son, gave his parents' archives to the Research Centre. The archive contains letters and scripts and audio material and pictures, and it is open for you all to come and peruse, and I would really like you to do that because it is absolutely a wealth of material. Daniel Miller also made a very generous donation to the centre that became the basis of a trust fund which now supports a whole host of activities. There's a conference that happens every 3 years. It's a major conference which is then published. The proceedings of it are published. The trust fund has also funded several bursaries for doctoral study. One of our doctoral students is sitting in the audience. And a number of visiting fellowships, etc., etc. And of course, one of the things that is funded by this as well is this annual lecture. So this year's lecture is given by the historian Robert Knight, and I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to him. Robert studied history at Cambridge, Würzburg, and the LSE in London. And he completed a PhD there at the LSE on British policy towards Austria in the Cold War. He taught at Salzburg, Vienna, and Loughborough, and he is now an Honorary Research Fellow at the UCL Centre for Collective Violence, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Never afraid of controversy, Robert has throughout his academic career been a sharp critic of Austria's post-war stance towards the country's Nazi history and legacy. In 1988, he published an edition of the Austrian cabinet discussions about the restitution of Aryanized property. And indicating the Austrian government's attitude towards restitution, he entitled it, Ich bin dafür, die Sache in die Länge zu ziehen. I am in favor of stringing things out. Robert's research has also contributed in a very outspoken way to debunking Austria's myth of having been a collective victim of National Socialism. Articles published in the Journal of Modern History, the Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook, the Journal of Contemporary History, and also the Times Literary Supplement, that last one caused quite a stir, testify to this. In 1998, he was appointed the international member of the Austrian Historians Commission, which was set up to report on Nazi expropriation and post-war restitution and compensation policies. They published their findings in 47 volumes, in 2002. After extensive research into ethnic conflict, Robert published a further monograph in 2017 entitled Slavs in Post-Nazi Austria, the Politics of Assimilation. It exposed racial discrimination against the Slovene population in Carinthia in the post-war period, 1945 to 1960. His current research project compares the trajectories of Austria and West Germany regarding the remembrance of the Third Reich and lessons learned from it. And we shall hear more about this in a moment. But before we do, allow me a little aside, because I do want to mention a personal link between Robert and our institute. In 1960, Robert's father, Professor Kenneth Knight, joined the IMLR, then the Institute of Germanic Studies, of course, as secretary librarian. And again, I'm imploring you to go to the archives, because if anyone's interested, go to see the papers. His papers were kindly donated to the Institute's archive and are available for you to see there. Now, I'll leave the floor first to Tony and then to Robert, and please help me to welcome him.
Thank you very much, Adenauer. My name is Anthony Grenville, and I'm the chair of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Studies. I'd like to thank you all for coming and welcome you here. This is not our usual venue, but I see you've all managed to find it anyway. Normally we meet in Senate House. I would also like to repeat what Godela said and thank Daniel Miller very much for his very, very generous bequest to our research centre, which has enabled us to carry on a good deal of work. I'd also like to thank Jane Lewin for making the organisational arrangements, including the change of venue, which we very much appreciate. Just a few words about Robert Knight from my own personal perspective. I am myself the son of refugees from Austria. My parents both came from Vienna in 1938. And I must say that Robert Knight's writings have been something of an education for me at an age when I really shouldn't have needed educating anymore. We used to go to Austria. I first went to Austria as a very small child in 1951 or 52. We went to the Tyrol. And later we went to Perchach am Wörthersee in Carinthia, where I noticed vaguely that there was some sort of feeling between the local Austrian inhabitants and the Slovene speakers who lived on the whole to the south of the Wörthersee as you went towards the Yugoslav border. One of the things I did not notice, and nobody drew one's attention to it, was the fact that there'd been a sub-camp of one of the concentration camps at the bottom of the Leuro Pass, which leads up to the Yugoslav border. And I think that says a lot about my early perceptions of Austria. I thought people were absolutely charming. They were very pleasant to us. It was perfectly obvious that my parents were Austrian Jews by origin. I never had any difficulties in Austria. People were extremely charming, and not only in that sort of whipped cream Schlagobers style, but I thought they were genuinely friendly. In 1963, in my first year, the summer of my first year at Oxford, I went on a language course to the University of Vienna, and being of Viennese origin, of course scored very well and was awarded some sort of minor prize. And I remember the lady who ran the course saying to me, "Sie haben wirklich sehr Schönes geleistet." What I didn't know and failed to pick up was that almost exactly the same time, the trial of a very notorious Nazi perpetrator, one Franz Murer, was taking place. Maurer was in charge of the extermination of Jews in Riga. And this trial was notable for the fact, first of all, of course, that he was effectively exonerated, and that the witnesses who were concentration camp survivors were treated quite appallingly and were made fun of and so on. I became aware of this other dimension largely through reading Robert's 1988 edition, which Gödel has mentioned. Ich bin dafür, die Sache in die Länge zu ziehen. I'm in favour of dragging things out as long as possible, which threw a very sharp light on the post-war politics of Austria and its denial of its past. I wasn't, even at that stage, fully aware of the so-called justification for this, the proclamation of Austria in the Moscow Declaration during the war as the first victim of Nazi oppression. In the Moscow Declaration there was a condition attached to that, provided that the Austrians made a contribution to their own liberation, the condition that was only very dubiously fulfilled. I noticed, again, Gödel mentioned it, the contribution that Robert Knight made during the Waldheim controversy, and also that he acted in what in its time was something of a cause célèbre, the libel action brought by Lord Aldington against Count Nikolai Tolstoy, and this related to the handing over of Cossacks at the very end of the war, just after the end of the war, Cossacks and other anti-communists who'd been caught up and fought on the Nazi side or been involved on the Nazi side. The British handed them over in southern Austria to the Russians with, of course, predictable results for them. In general, I, of course, had I can't say I read all the 47 volumes, but I kept an eye also on the Austrian Historiker Commission. Generally speaking, I can only say that it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Robert Knight here, and I look forward very much to his lecture.
Thank you very much, Toby, and thank you, Gödel, for your kind words. Thanks, of course, to the Institute for the invitation, to Jane Levin for organising everything and including the transfer of the venue. Obviously, when I got the lecture invitation, I was very honoured and pleased to get it. I was honoured by the distinguished names who preceded me in this the series, and I also thought I have a kind of affinity to the occasion. In fact, an affinity, a threefold affinity. Gödel has mentioned my father, Kenneth, who worked in 29 Russell Square, the Institute of Germanic Studies, and his official title of Secretary Librarian. It seems to have been a flexible remit. Professor John Flood tells me that he had to shovel coal which had been delivered for the central heating system. On a different level, he worked hard on the Centenary exhibition for Gerhard Hauptmann in 1962, and together with Frederick Norman edited the volume of Centenary lectures which were published in 1965. So that's the first connection that I feel. The second one, a few doors further down in Russell Square, before it moved to Gower Street, was the home of Student Movement House, which some of you may be aware of. It was a club that was set up after the First World War and became an international meeting point for London University's foreign students in the 1920s and 30s. It was run by a very formidable person, Mary Trevelyan, a long-time companion of T.S. Eliot, and it was, or she made it really, a rare point of interracial meeting interaction in pre-war London. Visitors and members, including Paul Robeson and C.L.R. James, for example. My own selfish interest in Student Movement House comes from the fact that it was here that my parents met in 1942. Thirdly, and perhaps most relevant for tonight's lecture, I feel a kind of affinity between my mother's father, Heinrich Scheuer, and Martin Miller. Both were originally Moravian Jews. While Martin Miller was born in the historical town of Kremzia, Kromjajic, I've been practicing that. My grandfather, Heinrich Scheuer, came from a small village on the Moravian side of the border with Lower Austria called Schaffhof. Like so many Moravian and Bohemian Jews, they were attracted to the Magnet of Vienna. Heinrich Scheuer went there before the First World War, where he started work as a drafter, or the German is Redaktionskonzipist, for the Kaiserlich Königlich Telegrafenbüro. Later it became the Amtlicher Nachrichtensteller in the First Republic, and today it's the predecessor of the Austria Press Agentur. In 1910 he also worked briefly as a part-time secretary to Stefan Zweig. Both Heinrich Scheuer and Martin Miller were dedicated followers of German literature, the classics as well as modern literature. And since Heinrich Scheuer was a passionate theatre and opera goer, it is at least conceivable that he and his wife Alice saw Martin Miller and his later wife Hannah Norbert perform on stage. But of course the greatest difference between them is that while Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert managed to get out of Germany after the Anschluss and later had successful radio, film and stage careers, Heinrich Scheuer and his wife Alice were not so lucky. Instead, trapped in Vienna, they were eventually, like so many others, deported and murdered. Turning to tonight's lecture, I'm trying here to approach a question which has rarely been systematically investigated. What was the difference in the way the legacy of National Socialism was addressed or, inverted commas, managed in Austria and West Germany after the war? The similarities, contrasts and antitheses between Germany, or German Prussia, and Austria have, of course, been the stuff of countless essays, mainly from the Austrian side, it has to be said. Many of these are brilliant, like Hugo von Hofmannstahl's famous Schema of 1919. I'm not even attempting to tread in these illustrious footsteps tonight. Neither am I denying in general that essays can give us important insights, impulses, or provocations. But I want to try and avoid the essayistic mode, and I hope, by doing so, I hope to move away from the stereotyping, positive and negative, which still sometimes hangs over and distorts discussions of Austrian-German topics. The discussion of the so-called national question in Austria was long marked by two competing essentialist assumptions, if I can use the jargon. The first assumption was that Austrians were essentially, whether racially, culturally or linguistically, Germans, in one sense or another, that their particularities were in the end no more substantial than, shall we say, those of Bavarians. This position, of course, became partly taboo after the greater German Third Reich collapsed, yet it still lurked, perhaps even still lurks in the shadows, as a position against which a second, essentially Austrian national identity was developed, asserted, or demonstrated. I won't go into the details of that now, because it's quite a long and complicated discussion. But what I do want to say out of that discussion is that in many of these accounts, one allegedly essential Austrian trait, that of Schlamperei, or perhaps we can say mixed in with it a touch of another allegedly essentially Austrian trait of Gemütlichkeit, that this trait was positively connotated when applied to Nazi rule. With it, the österreichischer Mensch, the Austrian person, appeared less ideologically driven, less fanatical, less precise in carrying out orders than his or her German or German-Prussian counterpart. I'll just give you one example. The explanation given by the then Austrian Foreign Minister in 1947 that detailed Yugoslav charges about Austrian participation in war crimes in the Balkans could not possibly be accurate. A priori, without bothering to go into a detailed refutation, he explained that participation in war crimes, quote, contradicted the Austrian national character, end of quote. But over the past 3 decades, I think, especially since the so-called Waldheim affair of the mid-1980s, this has changed. In a sense, the stereotype has been flipped. It has been used increasingly, not as an example of Austrian resistance to Nazi ideology, but rather an explanation of the deficiencies in the Austrian response to National Socialism in the post-war era. Self-critical Austrians, as well as non-Austrians, often ascribe these failures to the sloppy relationship with the truth, the so-called schlampiges Verhältnis, which is also related by many writers to a basic lack of civilcourage. Personally, I doubt whether this reintroduction of stereotyping by the back door is very helpful. You'll perhaps notice that in my title I refer to the blurring of the lines, which could appear quite close to Schlamperei, but actually I deliberately wanted to avoid the term. Instead, I want to try and pursue a term used by the German historian Norbert Frei in his seminal work on the early history of the Federal Republic, the book called Vergangenheitspolitik, in English, The Politics of the Past. In his book, Frei uses the term normative Abgrenzung, or normative demarcation, to explain how a kind of consensus of exculpation and forgetting gained momentum in the early 1950s in the Federal Republic, evading any self-critical discussion of complicity and pushing for the rehabilitation or return or freeing of unrepentant Nazis. Yet Frei also shows that other factors, above all Allied interventions, did, in the long term, block attempts to re-establish extreme right or neo-Nazi influence. And by doing so created the preconditions for the critical confrontations in West Germany in the 1960s and the 1970s. One way of understanding normative Abgrenzung or normative demarcation may be to see it as the antithesis of what could be called a pragmatic or instrumental demarcation. The difference between the two was meant to be detected by post-war surveys of German opinion, most of them conducted by the Americans in Germany. The British don't seem to have had enough money to organise opinion polls or questionnaires. The question was whether the respondent agreed that National Socialism had been eine gute Sache, aber schlecht ausgeführt, a good thing but badly implemented, and responses to that regularly achieved high 30s, 40% in the immediate post-war period in Germany. Instrumental demarcation, unlike normative demarcation, was the view which, according to one British intelligence report in Austria, dated 1946, was shared by those Austrians who, quote, were now anti-Nazi, but not because Nazism was bad, only because it had failed. That attitude, according to this British report, based in Austria, in the British zone, in Carinthia, was held by a large proportion of the people who were asked. Finally, I think it's important to understand normative demarcation not as a type or as a category of post-Nazi society, but as a process or as a tendency which may involve two main aspects. Firstly, the process of excluding or quarantining to prevent the return of prominent or influential Nazis to positions of political or economic influence. Secondly, in public or political discourse, the process of drawing red lines to make certain kinds of arguments and language, as it were, beyond the pale, particularly those which validated racial hierarchy and, above all, anti-Semitism. So in the rest of my lecture, I go through 4 steps which I hope will make this clearer. Firstly, I start with a brief comparison of the starting positions in Germany and Austria at the end of the war. Secondly, a comparison between the political dynamics in West Germany and Austria in the first post-war decade. Thirdly, I discuss the different patterns of international and occupation policies in the two countries. Fourthly, and lastly, I compare West German and Austrian policies towards so-called Wiedergutmachung, restitution and compensation policies. So that's my basic structure, which I could have put up on a PowerPoint, but decided it wasn't worth it. I hope I'll be able to fit them all in. I start then with Germany and Austria at the end of the Third Reich. The utter devastation which the end of the war brought to Germany hardly needs recalling here. Among many other works, I refer you to Richard Wessel's work on Germany in 1945, which graphically describes the swathe of destruction, killing and mass rapes of the final months of the war. Yet not every part of Germany and Austria suffered the same depth of destruction. Without wishing in any way to minimize the sufferings of those individuals who were living in Austria, I think it's clear that overall, this includes of course many Germans who were evacuated there, but overall they suffered less than elsewhere. Allied bombing had been somewhat less destructive of Austrian cities. The battle for Vienna, brutal though it was, brought fewer casualties than the Battle of Berlin. In some areas, for example the British zone, supply and nutrition only became really acute problems for the German or Austrian population in the aftermath of the war. Of course, we should beware of drawing simplistic, generalized conclusions from this, or conclusions about popular attitudes. Bessel argues that for Germany, the collapse and final destruction of the last few months made clear to nearly all Germans, quote, the complete and obvious bankruptcy of National Socialism. But bankruptcy can of course mean many different things. In the case of Austria, it may well have been applied to what was called this pan-German dream, the dream of a greater Germany, which for many in all political camps had been realized in March 1938. But what about the values which had sustained Nazi rule and allowed it to function alongside the terror and the coercion? One important comparative point here, which is, I think, not often discussed, is quite simply that for most Austrians, the trajectory of Nazi rule was different. Admittedly, in terms of Wehrmacht dead, maimed or missing, it differed little. But this also points to another important point of difference. For most Austrians, Nazi rule was overwhelmingly a wartime experience. In other words, most Austrians had not lived through the cumulative and, in a sense, successful consolidation of the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1939. Instead, the massive weight of the Nazi state, propaganda, SS and Gestapo-led repression came in a matter of weeks, or at least months, in 1938. That also suggests that in the post-war period there was a different generational dynamic at work in Austria. It meant, for example, that the so-called high York generation, or the younger generation, shall we say, of those aged 15 or older, in Austria still probably have memories of a life and a school which differed from Nazi rule, i.e. going back to 1938. We can perhaps speculate that they did not experience the collapse of Nazi rule in 1945 in the same traumatic way as those young Germans who had lived through the system from 1933. Secondly, there was also, I think, a different intellectual dynamic at work in post-Nazi Austria. There were plenty of post-mortems conducted in the aftermath of war, but they were not simply a replication of German debates. While in Germany, these debates often circled around the collapse of the Weimar Republic and past shortcomings, real or alleged, of liberal parliamentarism, in Austria they returned to the decline and collapse of parliamentary democracy in the First Austrian Republic, and to the establishment of the authoritarian regime under Dollfuss in 1933 to 1934, as much as to the Anschluss itself. However, when it came to identification with the core aspects of Nazi ideology, above all with anti-Semitism, the persistence in both Germany and Austria, I think, is clear and undeniable. And here I do not see any real evidence for a substantive difference in attitudes between the two countries. For example, if you look at attitudes towards Jews in DP camps in Bavaria or in Austria after the war, I don't see any significant difference. Turning then, secondly, to the dynamics of post-war politics. For several reasons, but largely because of the early Cold War, politics in Austria was allowed more space and sooner than in West Germany. To use a term later applied to the Federal Republic, it had enjoyed, quote, semi-sovereignty much earlier. Party politics began in the spring and summer of 1945. National elections came in November. Now, if we accept that anti-Semitism and other core racial values which had bolstered the idea of German superiority, that these had broadly the same salience in Austria as in Germany, the question then arises, or shifts, if you like, to the leadership and the so-called elites. How far were post-war leaders or political elites able or willing to act in spite of these popular attitudes and the persistence of these attitudes, or even attempt to change them? My tentative argument here is that in neither case were they either able or willing, but that it was a different kind of unwillingness in the two countries. I focus here particularly on the political system and the difference in the ways public opinion was articulated through the political parties. In Austria, popular attitudes were channeled through the system later labelled Proports, a kind of deal between the two main parties, the People's Party and the Social Democrats, or the Socialists. A combination of bargaining patronage, which really lasted until the 1960s in terms of the grand coalition between the two, and in some areas of life, for example, social policy and wage bargaining, lasted much longer. That, it seems to me, is what tied post-war Austrian elites of the two camps together. And here I would make a skeptical comment on the so-called Geist der Lagerstraße, the so-called spirit of the camps, which is basically the story that post-war Austria saw a coming together of the left and the conservative Catholic right, as it were, through the educative experience of persecution under National Socialism, and that this lesson had essentially been learnt through the experience of being imprisoned by the Nazis in concentration camps. Of course, there are some individual cases, but one reason why I'm sceptical about it is that out of the leadership of the two main parties who had been in Nazi camps, almost all of them were the Conservative People's Party, former Christian Socials, as well, of course, as the Communists. But the Communists weren't part of the proports system. They left the government in 1947. And those Christian Social Conservative politicians had themselves supported Austria's slide into authoritarian rule before the Anschluss under Dollfuss and Schuschnigg. In the process of Austrian denazification, the wheeler-dealerism, if I can call it that, of proports, was central. Exemptions from denazification, from its sanctions and exclusions, required party patronage. Of course, it also happened in West Germany, but the central difference between the two countries is the much greater space that political parties enjoyed to exercise this patronage. And at the same time, and in a sense as a reflection of this, the possibility they had of articulating popular opinion. As I said, there was an elected Austrian parliament in November 1945, and as early as spring 1946, there were implicitly anti-Semitic comments voiced in the Austrian parliament, not accidentally in connection with the first attempts to legislate for restitution. By the end of 1946, calls to, quote, finally wind down denazification were widespread in Austria. It was condemned, also incidentally, by Friedrich Hayek in The Spectator in 1947 for the blunders of Allied policy. But it was also condemned on moral grounds as contrary to fundamental Western legal and humanitarian and Christian values. The reintroduction of the bulk of former Nazi Party members, so-called less implicated, started in Austria well before the formal reenfranchisement in May 1948. These are the so-called minder belastete, or what one British report called the return of the prodigal sons. The founding in the following year of the League of Independence, the forerunner of today's Freedom Party, FPÖ, resulted in a 20% vote in the elections of October 1949. In West Germany, of course, the return of Nazi members to key administrative positions followed a broadly similar dynamic, but I would argue it involved more public debate and controversy. Above all, the energetic public lobbying for a general amnesty in West Germany and the debate over the return of denazified civil servants caused a huge uproar, really, and including public opposition to it. By contrast, in Austria, this reintegration was much quieter and more piecemeal. And I think that has important long-term implications. Turning now to the next part, discussing international components or Allied interventionism. In my structure, I've placed internal politics before international politics, although of course the distinction between them is artificial at the best of times, especially when you're talking about an occupied country. But I do so in order to question the argument, which you often hear, that the basic difference between Austria and Germany boils down to the readiness of the Allies to treat Austria as, quote, the first victim of Hitlerite aggression, as we've already heard. Those words in the 1943 Austria Declaration in Moscow. In fact, Allied policy was more ambivalent than this might suggest. You know, in other words, Austria didn't receive its liberated status on a platter, as is sometimes argued, or a kind of blank check. Broadly speaking, occupation regimes in Austria and Germany started off with similarly strict guidelines. In Austria, they soon became less punitive, and one obvious reason was that the strategic aim of fostering Austrian national identity against Germany was really common ground, with some variations, between East and West. On top of that, the Cold War became axiomatic for the West that the only real danger to Austrian democracy came from the prolongation of the four-power occupation. In other words, the continuing Soviet presence and the activities of the Austrian Communist Party. The persistence or revival of far-right attitudes and activities did not cause the same concern, at least as long as it did not involve explicit demands for a new Anschluss, which in most cases didn't, only in a coded form. The contrast between Western laissez-faire in Austria and Western readiness to intervene in West Germany becomes clear in the 1950s, early 1950s, as the lobbying for the release of war criminals imprisoned by the Allies in Landsberg prison and elsewhere intensified. At the end of 1952, this led the British High Commissioner in Germany, von Kirkpatrick, to a public rebuke. He reminded the German public of the sickening crimes of those imprisoned, which were, quote, crimes under the moral law and under the law of every civilized country. Soon afterwards, in January 1953, the British authorities intervened against the organized infiltration by former Nazis of the Nordrhein-Westfalen Free Democratic Party. They arrested Werner Naumann, who had been the last leading official in Goebbels' propaganda ministry, and other leaders. Norbert Frei stresses the importance of the intervention as a marker and as a warning for West German politics. He concludes that, quote, the latent threat of Allied intervention was of inestimable importance for the internal development of the early Federal Republic. Time permitting, I want to draw a brief contrast between the Naumann affair and the Amschel affair. I don't expect most of you have heard of Amschel. I probably should call it the Amschel non-affair. In the British zone of Austria 3 years earlier, at a time when, as I said, both the less implicated Nazis were returning to the electoral role and were clearly going to play a key part between the two parties, both Austrian parties were actively courting the prodigal sons and daughters. The British authorities, and to a lesser extent the Americans, basically sat on their hands and did nothing. One exception who proved this rule of laissez-faire was the head of the British legal division in Austria, Sir Alfred Brown. The last straw for him came at the end of 1948. Hans Amschel, the People's Party state prosecutor in Graz, showed striking unwillingness to intervene towards new neo-Nazi groups and their publications. You may get an idea from one of the titles that he allowed to be published, the Alpenländischer Heimatruf, which I think probably tells you all you need to know. After intense lobbying on behalf of one imprisoned prominent Nazi industrialist, his name was Adolf Funder, a leading timber magnate, I think his firm is still in action, still prominent. He was imprisoned, then he was released, then he was imprisoned again. Finally, Amschel ordered the prosecution be dropped and Funder be released. Brown now pushed for Amschel, i.e. the state prosecutor, to be dismissed for what he called, quote, the deliberate prosecution of the administration of justice. he seems to be unaware that the British were tapping his phone. This is when, as a historian, you kind of see the positive side of phone tapping. That won't be in the written version. British phone taps showed that after being congratulated on the outcome, Amschel had replied that, quote, "It had been difficult, but in the end it went okay. Es ist schwer, aber doch gegangen." Deputy Government of Carinthia was also overheard in a phone conversation arguing with a judge who wanted to proceed against Amschel, stating that justice has to be the servant of politics and follow the wishes of politicians. Dass die Justiz eine Dienerin der Politik zu sein und Wünsche der Politiker zu befolgen hat. But as I said, there was no Amschel affair. Amschel went on sick leave and then became deputy mayor of Graz in the 1950s. And above all, the row never became public. I think the British Deputy High Commissioner's rationale for not intervening is noteworthy. Quote, "Central Europe is not England, and that to overdo the governess attitude, governess in inverted commas, at this late stage may only do harm." End of quote. What are the wider implications of this for normative demarcation and the drawing of moral lines? I would argue that the barrier between the Austrian Freedom Party and the neo-Nazi groups to its right was significantly more porous in Austria than that set up in the 1950s in West Germany. I would also argue that the construction of the Grand Coalition, which ruled Austria till 1966, meant that both main parties in Austria were also more porous. The People's Party flirted with the idea of a alignment with Conservative and Freedom Party, sometimes given the rather grand label of Nationale Sammlung, and in a sense that's what was achieved in the year 2000 with the so-called Schwarz-Blau coalition, and again last year or the year before, which was finished earlier this year. At the same time, Austrian social democracy was open to the recruitment of former Nazi anti-clerical technocrats. Last not least, it should be remembered that until 1966, the Austrian Freedom Party was the only real parliamentary opposition in Austria, which is clearly a very different situation than in West Germany. Finally, I turn briefly to Austrian and West German compensation and restitution policies in the early 1950s, which in a sense is where I started from in my research. Here too, some of the basic dynamics in the two countries were not much different. The substantial material vested interest created by the so-called Aryanization, the expropriation, and those vested interests clearly wanted to limit it as far as they could. The mixture of fear of revenge, of a repressed bad conscience, resentments, sort of displacement, so-called Schuldabwehr, all these phenomena can be seen in both countries. What differed, as the question of Wiedergutmachung moved centre stage in the early 1950s, I think two things. Firstly, it's been said already, the level of international expectation and of course the level of interest in the much smaller country of Austria. Secondly, the way popular attitudes were articulated by politicians and political parties. If I can just briefly illustrate this by comparing Austrian and West German discussions at the highest level. Most of this is in German in the handout, so I'm giving you my kind of paraphrase and translation. In Austria, firstly, in November 1948, the cabinet discussion was of an American proposal for the United States Jewish Relief Organization to alleviate the wretched plight of the most needy Jewish displaced persons in camps near Vienna. The assets which Harold Trobe suggested could be used as security for a loan to help them came from the so-called heirless property. It's important to note that in principle the Austrian government had already agreed that these should be made available in one way or another to Jewish victims of Nazism. The proposal was therefore not in contradiction to the Austrian state's claim to have been a collective victim of Hitlerite aggression, in the word of the Moscow Austria Declaration. In other words, this was not about reparations in the sense of international law at all. However, most Austrian ministers did not see it like that. Their response was, to put it mildly, unenthusiastic. Finance Minister did admittedly cite moral considerations, given the extreme poverty in which some of the Jews were living and their particular sufferings under Nazi rule. However, he raised financial problems and feared that an agreement might be used as a precedent for other groups. And most of his ministerial colleagues too wanted to play for time or string things out. The quote from the Minister of the Interior, Oskar Helmer, SPÖ, Socialist or Social Democrat, which was the title of my documentary collection. They have achieved some notoriety since I published them 30 years ago. He actually said, "Ich wäre dafür, die Sache in die Länge zu ziehen." The publishers decided that it would be a better title to say, "Ich bin dafür, die Sache in die Länge zu ziehen." I'll leave it to the Germanists to judge whether that's a substantial difference. However, I would like to put it on record that the publishers didn't consult me before they shortened the title. Quote, "We're no longer living in the year 1945. The English are now fighting the Jews. The Americans haven't kept their obligations. The atrocities of the Jews in the Palestine War have had an echo. Traube should also be handled with caution. I would be in favour of stringing things out. Think about it," we should say to him, to Traube. "We have to take account of various things. There are certain people who understand that. The Jews themselves will understand it when they realise that lots of people are opposed to them. We should simply tell him, we'll see what we can do about it. Wir werden schon schauen." Helmer's position was supported by the Chancellor, who summed up, "The motion, I have a motion for support, does not have the support of Cabinet, but at the moment we can't afford to say no. Auch ein Nein können wir uns heute nicht leisten." We'll have to say, at the moment we're in the middle of budget discussions. Might be a useful tip for any realpolitiker. "We'll explain, give us some time to get our budget sorted and to see where and how we can help. We can give this explanation and then we'll have to see if we can't raise more funds in America." After 3 years of stringing things out, the question then came back onto the agenda with a new initiative, this time directly from the US government. The Chancellor, Leopold Fiegel, called for a coordinated answer, coordinated between the different departments. In resisting US pressure, Vice-Chancellor Scherf, a socialist, argued, I quote, that the Americans can't force us, and in any case, he was, quote, convinced that the number of Jews in Austria who died is relatively small, end quote, since most of them did, in fact, get out over the border. The Foreign Minister, Karl Gruber, apparently endorsed him, commenting that an estimated 20 to 25,000 Austrian Jews lived in the US. Scherf's party colleague, Helmer, actually contradicted his fellow party member about the number of Jews who had died. But Scherf was apparently supported by the Chancellor, who noted, quote, "The biggest Jew massacre, Judenmassaker, took place in 1942, and by then our Jews were mainly already gone from Austria with some luggage and 200 Reichsmark." End of quote. Much could be said about this discussion. But as time's limited, I'll stick here to the comparative point. I've also put on the handout a speech by Konrad Adenauer in 1952, which is roughly equivalent. It's not exactly equivalent because it's not a cabinet discussion a speech to the Bundestagsausschuss of the CDU just before the signature of the agreement with Israel that was signed in Luxembourg in September 1952. I think they are very different statements, even allowing for the different contexts. And I think it's worth asking why. I would suggest two key differences. Firstly, Adenauer was asserting himself, we could say imposing himself, after all, it was Adenauer, but against objections from within his own party, above all those coming from the finance minister, the CSU, politician Fritz Schäfer, who had resisted the extent of the deal that Adenauer wanted to push through. These were in these very difficult negotiations that had started with the Jewish Claims Committee, headed by Nahum Goldman. One reason that Adenauer was able to do this, which I think may be the important point, was, in the words of a leading German historian of the topic, Konstantin Goschler, that Adenauer pushed through the agreement with cross-party support from what Goschler calls a secondary level of politicians, including notably the Jewish Social Democrat Jakob Altmaier and others. And in fact, it was passed by the Bundestag against opposition from some CDU members and with the support of the SPD. Goschler calls this große Koalition der Wiedergutmachungsbefürworter, putting the term in inverted commas. And it was this combination which allowed the agreement to be pushed through in the face of objections from the public, hostile public opinion, and the press, including, by the way, from Der Spiegel. It's a different structure, if you like, from Austria. In Austria, by contrast, where there really was a grand coalition, there seems to have been an implicit coalition of the two large parties against Jewish and American pressure. And that common front was also enforced in the top-down way, which was characteristic of the proposed system. So that's the first difference I see between the Austrian and the West German discussion. The second point of difference, I think, lies in the logic of the arguments here. The Austrian position can perhaps be paraphrased as follows. We don't want to make any concessions to the Jews, and the Austrian people and the parties support us in this. In any case, Austrian Jews didn't suffer as much as they claim. However, because of the power of the Jews in the world, we can't say this, so we have to play for time. That's my paraphrase. This I would call blurring of the lines in terms of anti-Semitic discourse arguments. Adenauer, by contrast, seems to me to be saying, in effect, it is essential we do this in order to restore Germany's reputation in the world, and because terrible, unjust things were done, usually without agency, but he talks about Unrecht. And we should do this even if the public and the press disagrees. Furthermore, and of course he doesn't avoid saying this, we have to remember that Jews are a powerful factor in the USA and elsewhere. So you have similar kinds of arguments, but they have a different structure and place in the structure of the argument. Coming then to my conclusion, as I hope I made clear, I do not now want to contrast contrite or self-critical Germans with schlampige Austrians. No one who has read Mary Fulbrook's latest book, Reckoning, could reach that conclusion. She shows up the failings of all three societies in bringing an adequate reckoning of Nazi crimes. I think this is an important corrective, I don't know if it was intended as that, to some of the literature which extols what is sometimes called a West German Erfolgsgeschichte, or talks rather glibly, in my view, of a West German DIN standard, Deutsche Industrienorm, in the area of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash who coined that phrase, if I'm allowed to criticise Timothy Garton-Ash. Where Mary Fulbrook does see a difference between West and East Germany in particular is the growing readiness in the West to reflect and publicly criticise those inadequacies. She says, quote, "The difference was therefore more one of which political system differed, allowing public space for open debates, rather than which state actually meted out justice and punished past wrongdoings." And she concluded that a public reckoning with the past remained largely a matter of media discussions rather than legal judgments. So I think this point leads usefully to the question of the public sphere and the press landscape in Austria and West Germany. And the kind of trends which in West Germany gradually eroded this kind of deferential orientation of West German journalists, what Christina von Hodenberg calls the Konsensjournalismus, and replaced it with a more politicized journalism. This took place in Austria later and in a different way, partly because of the dominance of the two parties in the way I've described. German government policies and ministers were certainly criticized in Austria, but the criticism was generally channeled by the two main parties against their political opponents and against their own coalition partners. And both parties, for very different reasons, had little interest in discussing Nazi rule and Nazi crimes, or the participation of Austrian Nazis in them, or the attitude of the Austrian population. There were independent critical voices, but they were muted or absent. Leaving aside the Spiegel question, there was no real equivalent in Austria to the kind of left liberal voice like the Frankfurter Rundschau or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, or later, as it evolved, the Zeit. In the 1950s, the most critical independent newspaper in Austria was the Salzburger Nachricht, and it attacked the government, but from a perspective which was further to the right than the government, from a right-wing, sometimes far-right position. In this respect, at least, it seems fair to conclude that public criticism and moral outrage about the way lines were being blurred did become embedded in West German political culture in the course of the 1960s to an extent that it did not in Austria. Later, perhaps, from the mid or late 1980s, public discussion, commemoration politics, and general sensibilities in the two countries may have moved closer together or even become synchronized, as Katrin Hammerstein has recently argued. That, of course, is another story.